Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the first session of our Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes, or WIGL Summit. My name is Kari Hagenow, and I'm your moderator today. I'm a land steward for the Nature Conservancy and also the current president of the Invasive Plants Association of Wisconsin. I'm really excited to be a part of the kickoff to this summit. WIGL is a new collaboration founded in 2018 and dedicated to reducing the impacts of these invasive plants across the Midwest. I'll leave the rest of the details to our speakers today, but before we get started, I want to thank our session sponsors, which include WIGL and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. I also want to remind you that an evaluation for this session can be found in EventMobi and likely at the bottom of the page you're on right now. During our presentations, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll address them as time allows following each one. You can also send questions directly to our speakers. Their contact information is in EventMobi under the speaker directory. With that, we'll get started with our first session of the morning, which is Welcome to WIGL with Claire Ryan from the Midwest Invasive Plant Network.
Great, thank you so much, Kari. And thank you to everyone who's joining today. I hope you're doing well, hanging in there. I know it's been a challenging few days for many of us. So I do actually want to talk numbers briefly because I think it's exciting for us. So if you haven't figured it out yet, so I'm kind of talking to the audience, the WIGL audience who just joined today. But what they may not realize is we're actually on the fourth day of a week-long conference called the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference. And it's been just a massive success for us going online this year. It was nerve-wracking. I'm speaking actually also as the conference administrator for the larger conference. But we had about 750 people registered for UMISC. And then when we added in our WIGL audience, it pushed us over 1,000 attendees at this online event. So we are just thrilled for that. We're thrilled to have been able to offer the WIGL content here that you're about to listen to today and tomorrow free of charge. And I'll get on with my introduction. I am going to start with some housekeeping and just basic navigation of the online space. Again, this is primarily for our new attendees. And then just introduce the collaborative project with this presentation. And then Susan, at the end of this session, will be demonstrating some of the tools we have up on our website. So social interaction is quite a challenge for an online conference, but we've done what we could do. I just wanted to point out some of the static elements of the conference that you can access at any time to enjoy your time here a little bit more. So we have posters and exhibitors that are linked through your main menu. The posters are going to touch on topics related broadly to invasive species. It is not just woody stuff. And the exhibits, of course, also run the gamut. We have a group discussion board. Again, there's some kind of social channels. If you just want to chat with someone, you can do that there. But we also do have a woody invasive channel that I started. I started accidentally under my other hat as the help desk talking on there yesterday. But if there's a species you're having difficulty managing, or you want to just ask some questions and kind of crowdsource information, that's a good place to do that. We have Twitter and Instagram being pulled into our social feed, also accessible through that main menu. You can use hashtags. Hopefully the hashtag WIGL Summit will be working today. I asked them to do that, but if not, you can also hashtag UMISC 2020 and UMISC online to bring your tweets in to our social feed. And then this is kind of a late addition to the program, but I added a live Zoom social chat Friday right after the last session. If you're burned out, I totally understand, but if you want to come just casually chat with me and others about how to better get information about woody invasives out there in general and to engage more people, I would love to do that and just unwind a little bit at the end of what has been a super busy week. We do have help features if you need it. This is also linked through the main menu. So the help guide is a PDF you can download and troubleshoot your own way through a lot of common problems we think people might experience with the event space. We have a set of YouTube tutorial videos that also just demonstrate the main navigation features of the conference. And you can send a message to the help desk, but spoilers, the help desk is me. So you can also just send me a message. You can search me through the WIGL attendees directory. I should be in there. And yeah, I'm happy to help problems that you have, but obviously I can only do it between sessions because I'm wearing many hats. Another question that came up quite a lot is about recording. So we are recording pretty much everything for the WIGL Summit, and we will make as much as possible available to you after the conference as well. It should be pretty much everything, though I know sometimes there's issues with federal agency speakers need special permissions to have recordings shared. So we may not be able to share every single talk. So just keep that in mind, and please also don't expect it until probably early 2021. Just based on the sheer volume of video files that we're going to have to go through, upload, download, edit to get the speaker practice out and that kind of thing. So that's where we're at. Oh, I forgot I put that on my slide, but I already told you that. And so I actually, full disclosure, like I said, I'm wearing many hats. We don't have the WIGL evaluation up yet. I'm going to do one later today, and it will be linked through your main menu by tomorrow. Please do evaluate us because we did put quite a lot of effort into bringing this together. We would like to know how it served you and what worked best, what didn't work, and how we could improve to bring you content like this in the future. Last question that might come up. So we are offering some professional development credits through this event. This came together pretty late in the game, but we are able to offer Michigan certified applicator credits. I put this in emails, but it's not because we like Michigan better than any other state that's attending. It's because we got some back end help in Michigan just to get the credits approved and to figure out what we needed to do to track attendance for that. So thank you, folks at Michigan DNR, just for helping us with the logistics. Those are the categories. That probably means more to you if you're an applicator in Michigan than it means to me. We also are offering forestry credits via the Society of American Foresters. So what you're gonna do, if you want those credits, each session you attend is on a web page, and at the bottom of the page, there's links that are marked just like this. And there's a separate one for attendance for Michigan certified applicator credits and for the forestry credits. You're gonna go to that link, and there is a Google form. You're gonna fill it out. And it should look very similar to a form you would actually fill out in person to get similar types of credits. You're gonna need your license number for the respective license you're trying to get credit on. And I think that's about it. Do let me know if you're having trouble with any of those forms. You shouldn't have to sign in to them or anything. The other thing is they are time stamped. So you can't come back and do them like next week. You have to really do them during the summit. And I mean, preferably please do them within an hour of the end of the session for that session. We don't want to game the system. We genuinely want to offer the credits as they're intended. And the last one is, so someone brought to my attention the Wisconsin Cooperating Forester Program. This program we're offering is definitely eligible for that. But we don't have to do this this tracking. You can just self-report. to Wisconsin DNR for these sessions. So please do that if you're part of that program. So that's the housekeeping. Now, just an introduction to the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative. So it's kind of easy for the branding of WIGL to take over the fact that this is a project of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. And our board is fully behind it. Our board members, our board president, Mark Renz, helped me write the application, the grant application that made this happen. So MIPN is an organization, some people sometimes call it the SISMA of SISMAs. We serve an 8-state and 1-province region as seen here. And our board, so each of these tags on the map represents a member of our board. As you'll see, we've done a fairly good job, I think, of having good regional representation on our board, but we also find it very important to have a number of different types of board member, types of stakeholder on our board. And we're particularly proud, I think, of our nursery and landscape industry representation. When we're talking about invasive plants, and particularly woody plants, there are plants and traits that you know, come into play, and we really need to make those connections with nursery and landscape industry to get the job done and get the message out there. So, and not to downplay the role that our other contributors play as well. Federal government on there strictly in an advisory capacity. They don't vote on our board. We're headquartered at the Morton Arboretum. That was new as of 2016, and that's when I started working for MIPN 2 in 2016. Thank you to the Arboretum for all their support. I think this project in particular is kind of right down their alley, being a Arboretum featuring an extensive collection of ornamental shrubs, trees, and woody vines. And of course, because this is a GLRI project, we expanded our range a little bit to New York. I love New York. I'm a New Yorker, upstate. So that's important. And of course, Pennsylvania as well, part of the Great Lakes Basin in Erie County. Just a word on these invasive species collaboratives. So these are all organized or funded under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. The Phragmites Collaborative, I lovingly call the OG Collaborative. They started first and kind of made the model that others follow. I think they've had quite a lot of success in engaging stakeholders in conversation and organizing information, which is why GLRI kind of reached out and started funding more. I would say in terms of just timeline, the Invasive Mussel Collaborative came next, as did the Hydrilla Collaborative. This one is based out of New York State. And then these kind of on the right 2/3 of the slide are the new class of collaboratives that came out of the 2016 RFA. We've got Starry Stonewort, New Zealand Mud Snail. This doesn't have any text, but this is an invasive crayfish collaborative organized by Indiana, Illinois Sea Grant. These guys don't have a logo, but this is false smooth brome. This is another one out in New York State, problem plant spreading in the area, and of course, WIGL. And as you'll see in just a few minutes, there's some stuff that sets us apart a little bit from the other collaboratives. One, of course, being that we're not really talking about aquatic species, and another being just the sheer number of species that we're addressing. The runner-up behind us, I think, is probably the Crayfish Collaborative. There are about 6 taxa of invasive crayfish they're concerned with. We ended up addressing 28 taxa. And just to acknowledge too, the funding through GLRI got to us through a support agreement with the US EPA. And thanks for their patience, because it's been one heck of a project. So why did we want to talk about woodies? Why did we even propose to do this? Well, you know, I live in the suburban Chicago region, and we see a lot of this. So this is a forest preserve. Obviously, this is a mowed recreation area. But as soon as you get out of this maintained area, We have a forest hanging on here with just a wall of woody invasives, just a wall. And what's going on under that? This is a similar type of situation. This is all bush honeysuckle here. This is buckthorn. And nothing much else. You've got some grapevines here, but that is about it. Naked soil under here. Very few herbaceous species. They're kind of clinging onto the edge. This was a trail, so that I'm standing on the trail right here. This is the edge of the trail. There's enough light for stuff to grow. Behind in the undergrowth where there's all this honeysuckle, there's nothing. There's bare ground. You know, this is just an impoverished ecosystem. There is no habitat here. There's no cover here for, and this, I should say too, this is a river trail. So you've got the potential for amphibians to want to migrate through this area. There's no cover for them here. There's no food for them here. The other concern we have with bare soils here, you know, this is very much part of a watershed. And this just naked dirt is very prone to erosion and just leaking nutrients into the aquatic system, which GLRI, you know, it's a Great Lakes program that's really intended to address water quality. But, you know, I think we successfully made the argument that the upland ecosystem health very much plays into the overall health of the Great Lakes watershed and ecosystem.
5 minutes, Claire.
5 minutes?
Yep.
I'm good. Okay. So again, what is the purpose of this collaborative? I maybe won't read through all this because it's posted on the About Us section of our website. But you know, what we're trying to do first and foremost is just increase public access to high quality information about woody taxa, improve the flow of information between professional stakeholders, increase awareness, give them real tools that people can use to make better decisions and you know, more data informed decisions about how to manage on public and private land. And the end goal, of course, is to have a better Great Lakes basin, a more environmentally healthy Great Lakes basin. This is the complete list of partners that we engaged to start the project. We did our best to, again, have really good representation geographically and through different types of stakeholders. You know, we've got some unique ones here. We've got Midwest Ground Covers is a big nursery. Mark Holman Inc. is a landscape design or landscape architecture firm, Doty Nurseries again. So we've got those commercial enterprises well represented here, as well with academic partners, certainly nonprofit partners, and I'm probably forgetting folks. We've got, you know, government support as well for sure. Michigan, Minnesota, I know lots of time, lots of effort going into this. So our species, we don't have content on every single woody invasive species on our page. We chose 28 taxa that are regulated as invasive in at least one Great Lakes jurisdiction, one of the 9. We didn't include semi-woodies or sub-shrubs. So for example, you're not gonna see kudzu, which I would consider kind of semi-woody this far north. And we didn't do Lespedeza, Serratia lespedeza, which is kind of a sub-shrub. I will admit I missed one somehow, Siberian pea shrub. Whoops, my bad. So that might be the next addition we do to the site because there was an oversight to begin with. We are biased a little bit towards species that are already established in the region because they're regulated, though Wisconsin does a pretty good job of having some forward-looking regulations. And there's a little bit of a bias towards the more northern distributed species just because of the geography. So again, I'm not going to read all these, so I don't have time to, but we're covering trees, including some that are in trade, like Norway maple, for example. Callery pear is one of the more southern species that we managed to cover. It is also in trade. Black locust is a little controversial because it's native to part of Pennsylvania, however, not to Erie County. Shrubs, lots of shrubs, the buckthorns, the olives, winged burning bush, definitely in trade. Like you can't drive past a house without one around where I live. And then woody vines, zobai, porcelain berry, bittersweet. This winter creeper, again, a more southern distributed one that might be coming our way, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. I think that was my slides to introduce us. Did I go over?
That you are right on time, Claire. That is perfect. It doesn't seem that we have any questions in the chat, but that is all right since we don't have much time for questions at the moment. So Sara, I would think if you want to queue up your screen share. Our next speaker, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Sara Kuebbing with the University of Pittsburgh. And Sara is going to talk to us about restoring invaded forests, the ecological impacts of woody shrubs. And I will let you take it away, Sara. Thanks.
All right, let me unmute myself. Thanks so much, Kari, for that introduction, and Claire for the invitation to speak today. I am here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now, which I've lived here for about 2 years, starting my position, and I still don't know whether Pittsburgh is Midwestern or Northeastern. It depends on who you ask, but I do know, thanks to Claire's introduction, that my lab techs and students are out collecting all of these different berries of these woody shrubs that Claire just listed as problematic. So ecologically, I can identify as a Midwesterner. So today, since I'm just a little box somewhere on your screen, my name's Sara Kuebbing, and I'm a plant ecologist at the University of Pittsburgh, and I do go outside. I don't just sit here in my little mini desk that I have created now because of the pandemic. And I just want to say thanks to all the many collaborators and students. I'm going to be showing you kind of a mashup of research that I've done on invasive woody shrubs and the impacts that they had, and it couldn't have been done with all of these great people who have helped me in funding sources. So just a thanks to them up front. So one reason that I am concerned about invasive shrubs, and that Claire hinted to, is I love going out in the forest and I love looking for plants and charismatic things that look like this. And so these are a bunch of spring ephemeral wildflowers that got me through this spring during our shutdown in Pennsylvania, where the one thing we were allowed to do was go out and go hiking. So I got to spend a lot of time with these awesome plants this spring. And these plants that form these forests, some people don't get excited about them and may be more excited about other things that we find in the forest, but we can sort of all agree that these plants are the building blocks and the foundations of the food web for all of these other critters that our forests call home. And we also know that the plant diversity in forest and eastern deciduous forest, over 80% of that plant diversity is occurring actually on the forest floor. And so like Claire was showing you, some of those pictures of these depauperate forest floor communities are really problematic because we're losing a lot of our plant diversity when we don't have them underneath these dense invasions. And so I think a lot about the conservation threats to these forests. And I just want to say broadly that mostly I think about the impacts of invasive species, but there are unfortunately all these other stressors that we have on our forests, which include land use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, air and water, and invasion. And these are all working together, impacting our forests. And so my research program has actually broadened from just thinking about invasive species, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but thinking about how invasive species are interacting with some of these other global change drivers to change biodiversity and ecosystem processes in our forests. But today I'm going to mostly focus on invasive species because that is what Claire has asked me to talk about, and it's where I started my research. And what I'm going to talk about today, because there's a great lineup of speakers who are going to talk about restoration of these ecosystems, is I'm going to focus on how invasive shrubs are impacting or altering biodiversity and ecosystem processes in our forest. And I think this is a really important component because we have to first understand how these invaders are altering our forest, and then we can think about the restoration, which can then also teach us about the alteration. And so these are important cycles for us to think about as we go through researching and trying to figure out the best way to conserve our forest ecosystems. And so today, I'm going to just talk about two major components. I just want to talk about who are the major invasive plants in North American forest. And spoiler alert, you know, because this is a WIGL session. And then second, I want to talk about some research that I've done on the impacts of invasive plants in our forest. And so first, thinking about who the major invaders are in our forest, Claire has given a really extensive list of these woody invaders, but this data comes from a really nice paper published back in 2009 that was a nice synthesis of what are the invasive plants that we find in deciduous temperate forest in North America. And so not only do we have a lot of them, but you can see here that woody shrubs and woody trees are comprising most of our shade tolerant invaders that we see growing beneath our forest floor. We do have these forbs and vines and grasses, and probably most people on this could name a couple of those, but what we mostly see invading our forest are these woody invaders. And so it's a good justification to have a group that's just focused on woody invaders in our forest. And so now that we know that these shade tolerant woody shrubs are some of the most dominant types of species we find in our forest, we can then ask the question, well, what are they doing there? What kind of impacts? And Claire has given a lot of good information sort of foreshadowing the types of impacts that they have. And so I'm going to talk about two different types of impacts. And the first takes me actually down to Tennessee. So I know that is not the Midwest, but this is some research that I did early on in my career for my dissertation at the University of Tennessee, where I was asking how invasive shrubs impact forest soils. And one thing that we are starting to recognize as ecologists is that who plants are determines who is in the soil. So plants can, what we call condition soil microbial communities, so soil organisms like bacteria and fungi, and those communities of soil organisms differ depending on what plant species are growing in the soils. The other thing we're starting to realize is the plants that change these soil communities can feed back to affect the future performance of other plants living in those soils. And we call this process plant soil feedback, meaning the plants are affecting the soils, which are feeding back to affect the plants. And this is a real burgeoning area of study in ecology. And so we have lots of different ways we can look for plant soil feedbacks. We can do greenhouse experiments where we take plants and soils and we condition soils growing with different plant species through time, and then we see how they grow. We can go out in the field and we can actually plant species underneath parent plants and see how they grow under there to see how these soil organisms might be affecting the growth of these plants. And one thing that we've learned is that these plant soil feedbacks can be really important for predicting plant abundance on the landscape. And so we know general patterns that plants that tend to have what we call positive plant soil feedbacks, meaning they grow better in soils conditioned by themselves than soils conditioned by other species, have positive plant soil feedbacks and tend to be really abundant on the landscape. Plants that condition soils that they don't do as well in later on, because maybe they're accumulating pathogens that decrease the performance, tend to have lower relative plant abundance on the landscape. The other concerning thing that we've seen is a lot of invasive plants, not just woody shrubs, have these strong positive feedbacks, meaning that they do better in soils where other woody invasive shrubs of the same species are growing relative to soils that don't have those shrubs. And this is one reason that we think a lot of invaders can gain this sort of like these monodominant stands, like the pictures that Claire showed in our forested ecosystems and other ecosystems. And so I was interested in understanding plant soil feedbacks for the two most common invasive shrubs in Knoxville, Tennessee, bush honeysuckle and Chinese privet that are common here in Pittsburgh as well. And I don't know if they make it all the way up to the northern Midwest, but they may with the changing climate. And so we thought that probably it was likely that these plant soil feedbacks, these two woody invasive shrubs, would have these strong positive feedbacks. And so we went to test this by doing a greenhouse experiment where I'll walk you through this figure. We tested plant soil feedbacks where we grew plants either in their home soil, so privet or honeysuckle, and soils that were conditioned by other privet or honeysuckle, or soils that we collected from the forest that were not underneath any invader. So away soils versus home soils. And when I show you this data, if you see a bar graph that exists above this positive line, it means a plant's growing better in its home soil relative to its away soil. And if you see a bar going below the line, it means a plant is growing better in its away soil than its home soil. And this is what we found for privet and honeysuckle, not what we expected. So we expected both of them to do better in their home soils, but instead we saw that privet, which is our purple bars, didn't actually really care what kind of soil it was growing in. It grew equally well in its home soil or its away soil for this whole range of different types of performance metrics. And we saw that honeysuckle was actually doing better in away soil, in these uninvaded soils, than it was in its home soil. And that was confusing to us, so we did one more thing to try to understand what was going on. We took the roots of these plants and we stained them with blue dye, and we looked for either presence of something called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which are these fungi that live in plant roots and they create these arbuscules. And these are thought to be beneficial mutualistic organisms that help the plants secure other resources in the soil, water, nutrients, protect them from pathogens. So we think of them as the good guys that affiliate with plants. And then we looked for bacterial pathogens on our root stains on the soils to see how many pathogens these plants were accumulating. And so what we found for our privet was that privet was accumulating pathogens. We found pathogens and these AMF fungi on the soils, but there was no difference in the loads. And so maybe that explains why privet didn't care where it was growing, because it was equally susceptible to both pathogens and mutualists in home versus away soils. When we looked at honeysuckle, we found a different pattern. We found that it did have presence of these fungi, the mutualist, but it actually had no pathogens in the away soil, and it had a slight but significant increase in pathogens in its home soil, meaning that maybe these pathogen loads were what were making honeysuckle not grow so well in its home soil. And so thinking about this, we said, well, this is interesting, because now we see that our privet has this neutral feedback and honeysuckle has this negative feedback. So if we think about what that means, are these two plants going to decrease in the future in our forests down in Tennessee because they're not experiencing these strong positive feedbacks that we expect to see? But the other thing I noticed when I would walk around the woods in Tennessee is I could see the wall of invaders. Here's a really dense stand of privet. Here is our wall of bush honeysuckle in a forest. But there were also lots of spots where these two plants co-occurred side by side, stem by stem. So you found lots of areas that had co-occurring privet and honeysuckle. And so I was curious whether that maybe made a difference in these feedbacks. And so I went out into the field and I planted honeysuckle and privet seedlings underneath privet and honeysuckle in other areas. And what I'm going to show you now is just how those seedlings grew out in the field, whether they were growing underneath a honeysuckle shrub or underneath a privet shrub. Oops. And what I found was pretty interesting. So I found that my privet across the board grew better in honeysuckle soil than it did in privet soil. And this was out in the field under all the environmental conditions that these seedlings would face out in the field. Our honeysuckle did slightly better, but only in terms of height was it really doing better. But it did seem to strongly prefer privet soil over honeysuckle soil. And so even though their feedbacks were neutral and negative when we were looking just at their home soil versus these uninvaded forest soils, suggesting that they would decrease on the landscape, I think this is a significant finding that perhaps these feedbacks are actually promoting the co-occurrence of these two shrubs, and that these stands that have stems of both species may promote their existence for longer than if they were just by themselves. And so I think this is a really important and interesting area. There's not a lot of research on plant soil feedbacks and woody shrubs because woody shrubs take a long time to grow. But I think that these invasive shrubs may be altering soil mutualists and pathogens, and that sometimes they could be promoting other invasive shrubs in these soils. And this can be really important for thinking forward to restoration, where you're removing the woody shrubs, but you're not necessarily changing the soil communities. And so thinking a little bit about who's in the soil and the legacy effects after shrub removal can be really important. I'm now going to switch to some new research and actually some data that I just recently analyzed from some work we did this winter before our university shut down, thinking about the impacts of invasive species and how it might be interacting with climate change. And so how is climate warming impacting invasive shrubs in our forests? And so Pennsylvania, like a lot of areas, is seeing an on average increase in climate warming, meaning that our springs and our winters and our summers are all on average getting warmer through time. And we think this might have a big impact on the timing of when plants do things. And we've already accumulated a lot of evidence that plants are shifting when they do things like leafing out or flowering or fruiting, which are all called phenology. Their phenology is shifting with these warming climates. And so again, here are some pictures from that forest that I went for lots of hikes in this spring. And we can see differences in native and non-native phenology in this picture. And so in the foreground are burning bush shrubs, which were really common in this Pittsburgh forest. And you can see their dark green leaves, they're dark green because they're fully leafed out and fully mature leaves. In the background is a bunch of native spice bush. So one of the most common native shrubs we have in this forest. And you can see the lighter green leaves of this native spice bush. And these are lighter green, not because the leaves themselves are lighter green, but the spice bush is just starting to leaf out. So our burning bush has full leaves and our spice bush is just leafed out. And coming back to thinking about these wildflowers, this is really important. So this is a wildflower's eye view underneath a native spice bush on the left or a non-native burning bush on the right of how much light is coming through in this early spring. And so you can see here that wildflowers are seeing significantly decreased light levels in the early spring. And this is really important because a lot of these wildflowers need these early light periods before the tree canopy leaves out to gather a lot of light and a lot of their carbon accumulation that they need for the year. And so decreasing light levels can have significant long-term population impacts on these wildflowers. But not only do native and non-native shrubs have these different phenological patterns that are really obvious, but we think that they might actually be responding to climate change differently. And so my lab group is starting to work on understanding why this might happen. And so one thing that we think is that these plants are responding differently to environmental cues. And so if you're a temperate deciduous forest species having to make a decision of when you're going to leaf out in the springtime, it's actually pretty tricky because if you leaf out too early when it's still cold, you are risking a frost that could damage all of your early leaves. But if you leaf out too late, then you might miss critical periods of time for acquiring resources. We also think that our different forest species might be responding differently. And so what we did was we set up an experiment last fall where we went out into the forest and we actually buried potted plants of a bunch of these spring wildflowers into the soil. And we tagged a bunch of trees and woody shrubs, native and invasive, all around the forest. And we put up temperature loggers so we could log the temperature. We found a retired arborist who was willing to climb into some trees to put some temperature loggers high up. We put them low down and we put them actually in the soil so we could see what temperatures these plants were experiencing throughout the winter. And then a couple points in January and February throughout the winter, my team went out and we clipped a bunch of branches from all of these plants. We dug up a bunch of our wildflowers. We brought them back to the lab where we made these beautiful bouquets of twigs and stems, and we put these dirts. My colleagues thought I was out of my mind, that this was actually science happening. But we put all these into growth chambers. We put them into two different types of growth chambers, simulating an ambient spring and a warm spring for here in Pittsburgh. And to everyone's surprise, including my own, because I was skeptical that this was going to work, our plants loved their cushy spa home. They leafed out, they flowered, they did all the things that they would normally do out in the woods, but they did it in January. And it was really nice to go down to the growth chambers and see. And so we monitored the leaf out and flowering of these plants and the timing. And I'm just going to share you some of the results that we found for one of our phenophases, days to leaf out, depending on when we collected our plants for our canopy, midstory, and wildflower plants. And so this is how long it took the plants once we put them in the growth chamber to develop young leaves. And so first I'm just going to show you our mid-story plants, and we had native mid-story shrubs, which are represented by these blue dots. We had non-native mid-story shrubs, which are represented by these squares. And we found some really interesting findings, especially for our woody shrubs that I'll share with you today. So we collected in January and February, and we can see that our native plants responded really strongly to this later collection date. So plants that were collected in February leafed out much earlier than the plants that were collected in January. And we think this has to do with accumulation of winter chilling temperatures, but it could also have to do with slight changes in photoperiod or day length, because days are also getting longer in the spring. Conversely, with our non-native plants, who, by the way, as we saw in the pictures, leafed out much earlier in the growth chamber than our native plants did under all conditions, we actually found that the non-native plants didn't respond at all to collection time. They basically leafed out at the same time, whether we collected them in January or February, but they did have a strong response to this growth chamber temperature treatment. So we see our blue squares, which are our ambient growth chambers, were a little bit later to leaf out than our red squares, which were our warmed growth chambers. And so what we're seeing here is that these mid-story woody shrubs are using different environmental cues relative to one another. And this can be really important as we think about moving forward with climate change.
2 minutes, Sarah.
Thanks, Kari.
Yep.
And so now I'm just going to flash this up to say we had lots of other interesting findings that we're still sorting through, where our canopy trees and our wildflowers were always doing things. But one thing that's really important is we did find that native plants seem to be more sensitive to our collection time versus our non-native plants, whether we're talking about our non-native wildflowers or our non-native mid-story plants, were more responsive to spring warming. And the other really important point is that these wildflowers were leafing out on average later, represented by the blue lines, than our invasive shrubs on average at all times. And so coming back to a wildflower's eye view, we can see that these light levels are definitely decreasing in these woody shrub invasions, and we think that will have lots of consequences. I'm going to skip that slide just to leave some time for questions. We are hopefully going to get started this spring and actually testing that. We spent this summer doing a bunch of transplants of wildflowers out at the forest, and we're going to set up a big shade experiment where we can simulate darker shading by invasive shrubs, earlier shading by invasive shrubs and trees to test actually the response of these plants and the impact on their growth and their flowering and fitness. And so with that, I just want to say that there's definitely some things going on in our forest with our invasive shrubs in terms of response to climate change, especially in the early spring. And with that, I'm happy to take 1 or 2 questions if they have any.
I don't see any questions, Sarah, but I think you have also butted right up against your 20-minute time.
Sorry about that.
No worries. That was terrific. And definitely some things for me to take away in restoring my own forest and spring ephemerals where I live. And with that, I'll invite Claire to share her screen again. She is our next speaker, joining us for a second presentation in our WIGL Summit. Claire Ryan, again with the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and she'll be talking with us about woody invasives of the future Great Lakes and EDDMapS predictive tools. Take it away, Claire.
Here I'm back, yeah. So this is a little bit of an interesting presentation to give because I'm essentially going to be demoing someone else's work, and we'll get to that. But I did, I thought it was such an important thing to be thinking about that I wanted to include it, even though the primary investigator on the project was not available to speak with us today. So this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but newsflash, right? Not all plants can grow everywhere. And you have cases, especially with ornamental plants, where a plant that can perhaps grow somewhere if it's grafted would not necessarily be able to grow in that location from seed. And just an example, there's sometimes arguments about where calorie pair can and cannot be invasive based on, in the nursery trade, generally these are grafted, root grafted plants that are growing, and they can sometimes survive into zones 5, 4, and 5, where it's not always clear they're going to reproduce from seed, but there's controversy over where they do and do not reproduce from seed. So, and this image, you're seeing on the right, this is a clip of the USDA Zone Map. Anyone that's into gardening or ornamental plants in general is going to be familiar with this concept of a growing zone. So one of the top constraints of where a plant can and cannot grow is climate. There's a range of temperature in which the plants are going to be happy, and then precipitation, of course, plays an important role as well. And how growing zones work is it essentially establishes a expected minimum temperature and a maximum temperature in which a plant is expected to be able to survive or not reproduce, but survive and overwinter. So when you see a plant at the nursery that says it grows in zones 5 through 8, that means in lower zones, so zone 4, and just for the colors on the map here, this teal is zone 5, and then this kind of light cornflower, I think this would be getting into zone 4, possibly 5B. This for sure is zone 4. And then this lightest color on here is zone 3. And I believe we have a little bit of zone 2 in very northern Minnesota. So if you have a plant tag and it says it's hardy to zone 5, it means you can expect to plant that plant here, where I am in the Chicago area, and it should not experience winter temperatures that are too cold for it to come back the following year. If you planted it in zone 4, or colder, let's say I'm up here and near the UP, that plant, you would not reasonably expect it to come back because there's a good chance it's going to experience winter temperatures that are so low that it destroys the root. I'm talking about perennials here, not necessarily annuals, which all of our woody plants are typically thought of as perennial. And then it does happen on the other end too. If again, my hypothetical plant here, I think I said was 5 to 8. So if I'm down in Florida and trying to plant it in zone 9 or Arizona, it's likely to experience summer temperatures that are too high for it to be comfortable, and it will wilt and die. So that's kind of how growing zones work. I'm sure for many of you that was just unnecessary, but just in case. And then there are other constraints though that determine where a plant can and cannot grow. Again, gardeners would be familiar with many of these. You've got your soil characteristics, including some organic richness, pH, that's the acidity, kind of the buffering capacity as well of the soil. And then mineral, I should really say nutrient availability, which is closely related to pH as well. And then you have habitat type. So as anyone that works in the invasive species field knows, some plants are very well adapted to do well in disturbed, poor soils, messy situations, whereas on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have plants that are highly conservative, usually not even in trade, in nursery trade, that really are only going to grow in an intact ecosystem. And then that's the spectrum. So you've got things that are very much between those two poles. Again, this is getting more into, well, in an ecological setting, you've got open canopy type ecosystems where you might expect the ground level is going to get a decent amount of light versus a closed canopy, which that's going to be very, well, it's a closed canopy casting a lot of shade, so you have very low light levels, and you have plants that thrive in either situation, and again, a spectrum in between. In gardening, we're used to thinking of this as, right, full sun, full shade, or partial. Predation and disease, of course, play a role in where plant populations are going to be successful. And on the invasive side, the situation needs to be right for the plant to establish, but there also has to be some sort of vector of introduction and then spread for invasives to take hold. Sometimes, or most of the time, I guess, in the species we're looking at, there was a historical human introduction, generally for ornamental trade, though only a small portion of our species are still in trade today. So that's how they came, how they're spreading. There are different ways, but primarily for the species we looked at, we're seeing a lot of bird movement. Some are wind and some are still being sold and planted. So we're mostly going to talk today about climate. Again, I think many of us are very comfortable with this idea of climate, the growing zones constraining where plants can grow. But we're expecting all of this to change and change quite dramatically in response to climate change. Now, with the growing zone map, I know there's always controversy. I'm actually gonna, if I can back up, go back to the slide. So this, again, a clip of the USDA's growing zone map was last updated in 2012. And every time they do update it, there's controversy over the extent to which it reflects changes in climate. And unfortunately, it has become this very politicized thing. So, you know, this may or may not reflect accurately the 2012 climate. Does it reflect a 2020 climate? It may not fully. And because of this, because of climate change and the things we might expect in terms of plants shifting their range and the migrating climate. So these maps were generated by Union of Concerned Scientists in 2019 for the Midwest. And what we're seeing is that in the future, and in some cases, the very near future, Michigan is going to start feeling a lot more like central Indiana. And then eventually, as time progresses, more like Kentucky. And the differences between red and yellow are the emission scenario you use, lower and higher emissions. We're going to start feeling like Missouri by mid-century, and the rest of the presentation, the scenarios I'm showing are mid-century. And then end of century, Michigan could feel, at the worst case scenario here, like Oklahoma or Texas, and those are pretty hot, arid places. So that's a little scary. Okay, so the rest of what I'm going to show, I want to be very clear, this is not my work. This is the citation from Jenica Allen that she actually presented this earlier in the conference. I asked her to join today as well, but just due to her academic workload and COVID, she wasn't able to do it, which I completely appreciate. Because the tools are publicly online, I decided to go ahead and demo anyway. And I'm actually going to play a video. I'm going to get out of my presentation here, go into my browser, because she does obviously a good job of describing her own work. My computer's a little slow when I got Zoom running sometimes. But she also gives an example here that is a woody invasive species that I think we should be watching for. I'm actually going to stop my share and restart it because I think I did not click the box for computer sound. So give me 1 second. Okay, I'm back. And yeah, so this is a 6-minute video clip, and then I will be back.
Over here. Share.
While Jenica is concentrating on that, if you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature. And we do have some question breaks lined up. So, and we will ask those as they come along. All right, perfect. There you go.
All right. So many of you, hopefully anyway, have used the EDDMapS interface. So EDDMapS, it stands for the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. I like to think of them as sort of an invasive species data clearinghouse. So they manage a lot of geographic data pertaining to invasive species. And one of the things that is offered on the EDDMapS website are distribution maps. And if you click on distribution maps at the top of their homepage, it brings you to a page that looks something like this, where you get a big long list of species and then some options for different types of maps that you could look at. And so we asked early on, before we started the webinar, if anyone had particular species they were interested in. I'm just going to take the first one off of the list that I've been able to confirm we actually have a model for. So it was golden rain tree. And so the maps that I'm about to show you exist for 896 of the species in EDDMapS. We don't have a published list of exactly what those species are that is in EDDMapS specifically. So what I would suggest that you do, if you have a species that you are particularly interested in, just search for that species and you'll know very quickly by going to the species page whether we have range shift maps for it or not. So I found golden rain tree, which is the species that I'm looking for, and the range shift maps are available at the county level. So you click on county, and these are the distribution maps that you might be most familiar with. So these are observation maps. All of the green shaded counties are places where the EDDMapS database has information about that species occurrence in that county. The new tools that are climate change related are these future range and future certainty buttons on the county maps. So future range will bring you to, in this case, a map that looks quite orange. And let me just shrink my screen a little bit so you can see the legend. So the orange colors indicate range expansion. The light purple is range stability. So places where the species has been observed and we expect it to be able to persist there with climate change by mid-century, so 2040 to 2060. The dark purple color, which we don't actually see any on this map, is a range retraction. And so those are places where the species has currently been observed, but is not expected to persist in those locations with climate change. Now, climate change modeling is not so simple as you have a single climate model and it allows you to make ecological predictions. There are actually about 20 different climate models, and we use something called an ensemble modeling approach to take advantage of as many global climate models as possible to make our future ecological predictions. And so the maps that you see on EDDMapS actually require user input in order to define expansion, stability, or retraction. And so up in this upper left-hand corner, you'll see that there's a number of models, Selector, and it defaults to one model. And it allows us to choose how many of the future ecological predictions, so there's 13 different predictions, each of which corresponds to a different climate model. How many of those models have to agree on whether a particular county will have suitable climate for golden rain tree? So this is a very orange map. If we select one model, which means any one of the 13 models predicted potential suitability in each of these orange counties. But if we require more consensus, so let's say we pick 13, we see that we lose some of the counties anyway. It still is a very orange map. So this is a species that has high capacity for further spread with climate change. But we see that this group of counties, for example, up in the northern part of the US, many of those counties sort of drop off as no current observations and also unsuitable with climate change. And they're unsuitable given the requirement that all 13 of our future predictions are required to agree. So the number of models in this consensus idea sometimes can feel confusing in the beginning, but what it really allows users to sort of interact with and make decisions based on their own priorities is whether you want to fall very far on the one extreme of the precautionary principle continuum. So you want to know if any single model has predicted suitability for the species, you would pick one as your number of models. But If you are, let's say, trying to come up with a priority list of species, and so you want to have some higher level of certainty that most of the predictions or all of the predictions that we have suggest that that species will be in your county or in your state, then you would want to choose a much larger number of models, say 11, 12, or 13. And if you're trying to just sort of get a handle on what different selections would mean for the particular species you're interested in, that's where the future certainty button can actually be quite useful. So this future certainty button brings you to a new page that is actually a static map of how many of the 13 climate models suggested that each county was suitable for golden rain tree in this case. And so the deeper the green color, the more consensus that there was between models. And we have.
So I'm going to stop it there because I think we're running short on time, and I do want to show you just a couple of
tooltips on each
examples I've got queued up, and I've got situation with my Zoom.
Each of the counties, and so it identifies the county.
Oh, okay.
Claire, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to show just two. One is where we're going to expect a species to come, range to expand, and one is looking a little bit at contraction. So this is Polonia Topentosa princess tree. It is commonly found through the mid-Atlantic and in the south end of some of our states, but apparently also in southern Wisconsin. If we look at future range, and I decided for this demo, I'm going to choose 10 for my models. This is a species we should be looking out for through most, maybe not so much in Wisconsin, Minnesota, but in lower peninsula of Michigan, throughout, the Indiana portion, the Ohio portion, Pennsylvania, New York. This is going to be probably coming our way mid-century. And looking at certainty map for this. Again, it's very kind of similar. This coast of Wisconsin here, though, we might start to see it a little bit more as well. Okay, and then a hopeful one, let's look at Norway maple. So this is current distribution, future range. What this means, seeing a big retraction in Wisconsin and Minnesota. What this essentially means is climate may change to make these places inhospitable for Norway maple, whether it's the heat or precipitation. It's not 100% certain because this is only looking at climate. It's not looking at those other factors about soil. So, in one of these cells here where they're saying it's pretty likely that climate will be suitable, it doesn't necessarily mean the soils or the ecosystem type is suitable. So this is just a start. And I think going to my conclusion slide here, probably the most important part is that, so these are there for you to play with in EDDMapS right now, but it's not the be all and end all. We need more complex habitat suitability modeling and forecasting, and it's underway. So good stuff, interesting stuff. And I'm going to be quiet now. Bye.
And with that, Claire, you have used up your 20 minutes and 2 more. So I don't think it appears that maybe a question came in, but I don't think we're going to have time to touch on that right now. I'm going to roll us right into Susan Franklin, who's also joining us from the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. And Susan's going to be talking about the WIGL Collaborative's tools for understanding and managing woody invasive species of the Great Lakes. Take it away, Susan.
Hi everyone, I'm talking to you today from a very WIGL appropriate location on Lake Michigan, within the traditional territory of the Peoria and Potawatomi tribes. I am grateful to live across the street from Warren Dunes State Park, which researchers call a botanically diverse refuge for rare species. Ironically, the park receives about 1 million visitors each year, so spreading the word about protecting Great Lakes ecosystems is never far from my mind. Today I have the privilege of walking you through the content and tools on woodyinvasives.org, launched earlier this year by the WIGL Collaborative. Think of this website as a compilation of high-quality information for the 28 woody species currently regulated as invasive by one or more Great Lakes jurisdiction. Among other goals, woodyinvasives.org strives to better connect researchers and their findings with those working on the ground. The content is dense but structured for ease of use by a range of audiences. Let's take a quick look at each landing page before sinking our teeth into some of the new tools. Educators and lifelong students can learn to identify and report woody invasives in the species profiles. Landowners and managers will find the latest information about controlling woody invasive species in the Management and Control section. Gardeners can choose from curated lists of non-invasive woody species with similar desirable characteristics within the species profiles and in MIPN's Landscape Alternatives app. Those in the green industry can check to see how woody invasives are regulated differently among the states and the province of Ontario to prevent the sale of prohibited plants. Obviously, this content crosses audience lines, so it's meant to serve all walks of life with the information needed to manage and restore habitat around the Great Lakes. There are a variety of ways to navigate woodyinvasives.org, including a robust search tool at the top and bottom of each page. Let's check out the profile for one of the WIGL species now. Each profile is structured similarly and includes the level of detail you'd expect to find in botanical texts and field guides. There are at least 6 photos showing different characteristics of the invasive woody, and you can view captions by hovering over or clicking on the image. Note that the photos strive to show how the plant appeared in both landscaped settings as well as invaded natural areas. We also provide you with additional trusted resources for identification and more information in the form of fact sheets and videos, primarily from within the Great Lakes region. We've provided written and visual details about each invasive plant's distribution, with links to the mapping tools used by specific jurisdictions. The featured map is active, so you can zoom into your location and hover for data or click to access the EDDMapS site for more details. Under invasive impacts, you'll find the published references to this species' ability to harm the health of the environment, economy, or humans. In short, this is the information you need to bridge the gap from general traits of invasiveness to specific documented damage from a particular species. Because Japanese barberry and some of the other woody invasives continue to be popular and unfortunate choices for landscaping, we've included discussion on the current status of potentially less invasive cultivars. Before we discuss how the landscape alternatives are presented, let me quickly point out that we had an incredible group of subject matter experts who engaged in hearty discussion and careful thought to weed through potential alternatives for each woody invasive. I'm not going to explain the selection process or philosophy because tomorrow afternoon, Clair Ryan is giving a detailed talk entitled "Just Because It's Sold Doesn't Mean It's Good," using landscape alternatives to make good plant choices. I hope you can attend that session to learn more. Most of the WIGL species were introduced as desirable landscape plants. In presenting alternatives, we chose to cross-reference the most desired traits of the invasive plant with suitable non-invasive alternatives. As suggested by our existing Landscape Alternatives app users, we move native species to the top of this list. Those in green are native to at least part of the Great Lakes Basin. Those in yellowish are native to the U.S. but not to the basin, and those in blue are non-native but have been part of the developed landscape for a long time without showing any signs of invasiveness. The footnotes provide additional insight about how to proceed and succeed with these alternatives, such as when you'll need to stick to the nativar or cultivar referenced in the table to achieve specific traits not found in the straight species. The management section of each profile covers the techniques shown to be effective to control that particular species. Because execution of these techniques is fairly standard across all woody species, general instructions for each best management practice is explained in the Management and Control section, which we'll cover later. Note that each profile also includes a prompt to connect with one's local SYSMA, CWMA, or PRISM using an awesome lookup tool created by the Great Lakes Commission. And to prove we didn't make all this up, we meticulously cite third-party resources used in creating each profile. Now let's take a look at a brand new tool that will help you visualize the regulatory status of each woody invasive in the different jurisdictions that make up the Great Lakes Basin. We want to give a major shout out to the Renz Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for producing this handy resource. Each status is color-coded, with blue meaning the species is not regulated. This allows you to easily compare and contrast regulatory status with neighboring states and as a region. The map is also active, so you can hover to see the status or click the map or sidebar to jump to regulatory details, either within the website if the species isn't regulated, or directly to the jurisdiction if it is. I chose Japanese barberry on purpose so you could see that we've included cultivar exclusions where applicable. The information is current as of spring 2020, with a goal to keep it updated moving forward. Note that you can also navigate to regulatory information for other species from any profile page. Go Ohio! I think there is something more impactful about seeing this information presented in a map, so we hope you will share this new resource widely. Another tremendous feature of this website is the ability to export and directly customize a print-friendly data sheet. Let's try this out by clicking on the PDF icon. You can delete any hyperlinks for this print version, along with any other information that doesn't apply to your audience. The only area that can't be removed is the header with the web address. If you decide to take your customization a step further by exporting this content into another program, please consider crediting MIPN at the same time by adding in our web address, mipn.org. I point this out because WIGL doesn't have its own social channels. It piggybacks with MIPN to minimize demands on funding and staff time. At the bottom of any page, we can quickly navigate to other areas of the website. Let's check out the regulatory information page to wrap that up. In addition to having direct access to the regulatory status map tool, there is a wealth of information about federal, state, and provincial laws. We've also listed the top 3 most stringently regulated woody invasive plants, calling them the Great Lakes least wanted. You can put the mapping tool into action if you want to find out who is and isn't regulating these top offenders, and then learn more about the jurisdiction on its landing page. As a side note, we thought it was important to add some inspirational photos as well as invasive species to remind us what's at stake. This particular photo header features a globally rare black oak savanna at the Indiana Dunes, which was upgraded from a national lakeshore to the 61st National Park in 2019. Now that leaves management and control, where you can hover over to choose a preferred topic or click to arrive at the landing page. We hope you will find this section one of the most usable parts of the website, because as you know, there is no silver bullet. Controlling an invasion often requires more than one management tool and multiple treatments over many years. This isn't an easy undertaking, but at least you now have one repository for all things woody invasive. We already have an addition to make to the BMPs now that the first biological control method has been approved for one of the 28 WIGL species, Russian olive. I'll spare you the pain of listening to my Latin and just say that the biocontrol agent is one mighty mite. I think it would make a great topic for a future WIGL blog, so be sure to follow us via MIPN's channels for the latest WIGL news. Let's dive into one of these control methods, namely my favorite obsession, prescribed grazing. Here you'll find sourced information such as which livestock to use and when, planning and legal considerations, monitoring, plus the always important work clean go strategy to stop the spread of invasive plants. I like that in this case, disposal happens on site over a 24-hour period to allow digested seed to be expelled. There is also a separate disposal landing page that summarizes the various methods and their implications, including links to state-specific invasive plant disposal guidance. Now let's also look at one of the chemical control pages. I hope you can get a feel for the depth of information that we hope will help guide you through the more complex decision-making process for the use of herbicides. You'll notice some recurring language that defers to following product labels, but also direct guidance on issues such as choosing herbicides and calibration methodology. Links to state-specific pesticide training and certification programs can also be found here. In the future, we hope to add a table cross-referencing the 28 woody invasives with appropriate chemicals to offer further clarification. In the meantime, we recommend consulting MIPN's invasive control database. On the opposite end of the control spectrum is physical removal. Yes, it can be as simple as identifying and pulling a seedling from the base, but it's also about methods such as leverage and vehicle-mounted tools. Critically, we list out and cross-reference the species that produce root suckers and should not be top-killed without follow-up herbicide for fear of extensive regrowth. Like every page on woodyinvasives.org, you can generate a custom handout of the text. Well, I think we've covered all the high points of the website, but there will be more to come, so please connect with us, bookmark and refer to the site, and promote woodyinvasives.org through your own channels. We'd also love to hear from you with questions. And after you've used the site, please fill out this feedback form to offer suggestions to help us improve the content. We hope woodyinvasives.org simplifies some aspects of your work and proves useful in reducing the impact of invasive woody species in the Great Lakes and beyond. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Hi again. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I think we have extra time if anybody wants to dive into an aspect of the website that I didn't cover well enough, or Claire may have clarifications or items to add.
You did a fantastic job.
Oh, thank
no worries there. Yeah, so I am looking at the chat box. I'm gonna, I guess, just address some more general questions. So what about the CEUs? No, if you filled it out once, you don't have to fill it out again for the same session. Especially this first one, we'll go easy on the timing. Question about all these links. So we're using a lot of web resources and people are anxious for the links. I will get them up somewhere where you can see it and make it super obvious. I can't promise I'll do it by the next session because we only have a 20-minute break. But if I'm not able to do it, it'll be up by after lunch. Question, who would you work with to expand climate modeling to include other suitability indexes? I know Mark Renz's lab at UW is doing a lot on suitability modeling, and we actually had a session at the UMIS conference all about modeling. I would look, even if you didn't attend the whole conference, the list of speakers is available publicly on umis.org. I would look there and get in touch with some of those folks, perhaps, to see to what extent they're also doing climate estimates. And I think that's probably all we have time for. Someone mentioned the security, like their organization's web security is not letting them on the website. I will look into that as soon as I can to make sure we aren't behind on updating our security certificates and all that stuff. I got the web controls handed to me and I don't know what I'm doing, so I better go look at that. Thanks.
All right. And with that, I will just wrap up by saying thank you today to all of our presenters. We hope that you tune in for the rest of the WIGL Summit and have a great day.